So today we are very honored to invite Dr. Liang Guoyong to join us to give us a lecture. Dr. Liang, I wanted to give a very brief introduction. He has a very long CV. He's a senior economist at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. As a major author of World Investment Report for more than a decade. So if you know the World Investment Report, so he is the key person behind our report. He has very rich experience in economic research and international cooperation. And Dr. Liang has published widely and is the author and co-author of numerous scholar books and papers, and released in various languages. In 2016, his book, Chinese Economy 2040, is a very important work on the new landscape of deglobalization and its implication for development. And his academic book, The US-China Trade War, was published by Routledge in 2020. So Dr. Liang speaks at major international conferences and is frequently interviewed by mainstream media such as Financial Times and Xinhua News. He plays a very active role in public debate and economic issues. So a lot of what Dr. Liang is going to share today is based on his own research, his own writing, and his publication. So it's all original. So without further ado, let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Liang.
Thank you, Bob. Let me share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here again at CKGSB London to talk with you about a topic that I have been always interested. In fact, I have been following the trends of globalization and its implication for China since 2000. When I started my PhD. Now you know how old I am.
Dr. Liang, do you want to click on the slideshow at the bottom right?
Slideshow, okay, slideshow.
On the bottom of the screen, on the right. Yeah,
on the right.
Go down.
Oh, here, yeah, here. Okay. Here, slideshow, yeah. The problem is, you know, I cannot see the participants if I turn on the slideshow.
Oh, so, that's okay. You can keep doing like this.
Yeah, but for me, I cannot see you. I want to see you. So let me go back to the page like this. But I'm sure you will see it clearly, yeah?
What you can do is you can drag the panel on the right, you can drag the panel to the left, and to make everybody being seen by you. At the same time, you can do the slideshow.
Yeah, it doesn't work. When I turn on slideshow, I can only see the slides.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
You know, I want to have this session to be interactive. That's why I want to see you, you know.
That's good. That's good.
And I haven't seen you for a long time, so that's another reason, you know, I insist.
That's good.
Yeah. In fact, I have been talking about the same topic about a month ago to an audience of more than 700 people. So today, it seems to be a rather small audience. But don't worry, I will spare no efforts in sharing my knowledge, thinking, and insights about the issue. Yesterday, I sent to my colleague at CKGSB my PowerPoint slides, which has 40 pages. It's a bit long, but I didn't cut. In fact, I have cut, but it's still rather long. And some of the slides, in fact, I made specifically for you. So, but today, due to the time limit, I think I may skip some of the slides, or I may go through very quickly. But I hope you will be able to, grasp the overall structure of my thinking. Let's see what I'm going to talk. 4 main areas. I will share my thoughts with you about what's globalization and what's happening after the global financial crisis, which leading to a transition from globalization to deglobalization. There are several major events which mark this critical transition. I will not talk in detail about all these events, but I will highlight 2 among these events, which are the US-China trade war and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This is somehow the first part of my talk. And the second part will be about China. As you are here in this fantastic program of China Start, I hope this part about China, about its development model, growth prospects, and future economic transformation will help you to start better in China. So as I mentioned, I really hope, because this is a really small audience, I really hope this can be interactive. So I will speak for about an hour. Then we leave half an hour for interaction and discussion. As I mentioned, when I talk with the big audience of more than 700 people, in fact, among them, I think not many have entrepreneurial potential. But today I have the privilege to talk with you, a group of talented entrepreneurs. So I really appreciate this opportunity and thankful to Bo for his invitation. What is globalization? When I started my PhD, my professor, my PhD supervisor told me there's no globalization. Therefore, when you look at my PhD thesis later published in 2004, there's really the term globalization. I use mainly internationalization. But later, thinking about the definition of globalization, I think it exists. The problem is how to define it and how to measure it. So for me, globalization is increased economic exchanges between countries. These exchanges include trade, investment, financial flows, technological flows. And globalization also means a lot of cross-border flows of various items like goods, services, productive capacities, information, knowledge, people, data. More and more data are crossing the border now. Yeah. So what's the globalization is not new. It can be traced back to a strong wave of increased connectivity among countries before the First World War. And it can even be traced back earlier to the Great discovery, and so on. So what's new about the recent wave of globalization is the extensive, intensive, and proactive participation of countries, especially the involvement of major emerging economies like China and India. China started earlier in late 1970s, and India started later in early 1990s. But it was this involvement of major economies, major emerging economies with billions of population that brings this hyper globalization into reality. Of course, there are driving forces. I think the first major area of driving forces are technological. In terms of transport, container shipping is a major technological breakthrough. In terms of communication, submarine fibers, optic cables, and the internet are the game changers. And in terms of production, there's many technologies which can help us to, adopt a global production system to shift part of the supply chain from within the home country to emerging economies. Of course, during this massive process of productive capacity offshoring, new models of production emerged, like contract manufacturing. And let me give you one example. Everyone use iPhone. When we see the back of the iPhone, it said designed in California and manufactured in China, made in China. In fact, all iPhones are made in China, but designed by iPhone in the US. And what's interesting is the manufacturing part. Apple does not do any production anymore. All the innovation of Apple is focusing on the product innovation, and all the production innovation has been shifted to its suppliers, especially Foxconn. So in this case, innovation has been polarized. Apple focusing on product innovation, and Foxconn and other smaller suppliers focusing on product innovation. So this kind of new emerging, new production model emerged during this wave of hyper-globalization, which has reshaped the landscape of global economy. We can consider all these technological factors as the pushing factors. And on the other side, there are the pulling factors, which are institutional, policy related. So as I mentioned, the countries have been proactively participating in globalization. They use trade and investment policy to improve their business and investment regime and environment. And at the international level, more countries are signing trade and investment agreement at the bilateral level, national level, and the multilateral level. At the multilateral level, the most important progress is the establishment of the WTO, which has played a major role in reducing the uncertainty in the global trading system and promoting trade openness among countries. So how to measure globalization? Depending on what we define globalization, I think we need to consider the various international economic activities, including international trade, foreign direct investment, and other financial flows. And we can also measure globalization from the cross-border flow of data, people, and many other dimensions. Secondly, we need to consider the relativity. We need to not only look at the absolute values of these activities and flows, and we also need to use relative indicators to compare these flows to the total or to the GDP, global production. So this is a very brief overview of globalization. Then comes deglobalization. What's happening? How this wonderful phenomenon of globalization has come to an end, has been somehow, reversed. As later I will show you, a series of major events have weakened globalization and led to deglobalization, a process of intensified deglobalization. The first major event is the global financial crisis, which is a watershed in globalization and the world economy. It started in the US. Of course, there's, the major cause is from within the country, but there are also, reasons related to the global economic context, which has been categorized by the imbalances between production on the one hand and consumption on the other hand, and exports and imports in parallel way. And also there's an imbalance, to my opinion, between the need of the real economy and the strength of financial globalization. The latter going too far to surpass the needs of the real economy and created its own problems. And the crisis was a triple crisis. It started in the financial area and then spread to all over the economy. And it started in the US and then spilled over to other major developed economies and emerging economies. Yeah, we can say that financial crisis started in the US and then quickly become a crisis of other economies, like a debt crisis in Europe. And such a huge shock to the global economy has two major consequences, as I mentioned in a very early interview in 2009, the shift of the global economy from high growth to low growth. Later, I will show you the data. This prediction was true. And the shift of globalization from hyper to weak globalization. In that time, I used the word strong wave of globalization and weak wave of globalization. Later, in the Western world, people more and more use hyper globalization and globalization to describe the period of weak globalization. Let's look at my measurement. We can measure the globalization from the real economy perspective. Here, I use the column to show the volume of trade, including both trade in goods and trade in services. From this figure, we can say that before the outbreak of the financial crisis, trade had been increasing very quickly, and there's a wave of surge starting from 2001. Why? Because in that year, China joined the WTO. And later, the surge was mainly driven by the involvement of China in the global trade landscape. Yeah, and also from this figure, we can see trade growth has stagnated since 2009. And somehow we can judge that for the real economy, in relative terms, 2008 is the high peak of globalization. That's why we see, the global financial crisis is a watershed, and it's also the first major event shaking the foundation of globalization. And then let's look at the financial perspective. If you compare this figure, the column here is the size of financial flows. If you compare this figure with the previous one, we can see that the patterns of real economy and global finance in terms of globalization differs. The volume of financial flows shows a much greater extent of fluctuation. Secondly, similarly, the financial crisis marked the turning point. But for financial globalization, the change was much drastic. The retreat, or we can say even the end of financial globalization, was marked by the crisis in 2008. Therefore, 2007 marks the high peak. This is not the end of the story. After the global financial crisis comes a series of major events, disruptions, and crises, including Brexit, the election of Trump in the US, the fundamental change of US policy approach in terms of international economics, and which led to the US-China trade war. And then comes the pandemic, and then comes the war. So all this unfortunate series of shocks has glowed globalization and has weakened the process of globalization, which has started, as early this strong wave of hyper-globalization, which started as early as with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So somehow we can see the other major war in Europe marked the end of this wave of globalization. And the other interesting part of this figure is that all these events are interrelated. The fundamental change in the US policy led to the trade war. And the trade war, continued during the pandemic. And there's another war which further strengthened the anti-globalization sentiments. So we have been talking about deglobalization. Then what are the symptoms and the causes? At the ideological level is what I mentioned, this anti-globalization sentiment in Western countries, which has become widespread after the global financial crisis. Why? Because the benefits of the early wave of hyper-globalization is apparent, but not evenly, fairly distributed. There are losers and there are winners among the countries, and there are losers and winners within the country. In the Western world, the non-skilled laborers are clearly the losers. they are the Trump voters. Yeah, so they has used their power to brought change to Western democratics. They are part of this rising populism, which gave rise to trade and investment protectionism. And if we look at the symptoms of deglobalization, we can see the reverse flows of resources. As I mentioned, the defining feature of globalization is the flows of resources from industrialized economy to emerging economies. And now the flows has been reversed, going to the other direction. The first direction is called offshoring. The new direction is called reshoring. And after the Ukraine war, a new term has been coined, which is called friendshoring. You know, some countries are our friends. The offshoring should go to these countries. Some countries are not our friends, so the offshoring should be stopped. And the reshoring should be happening. All these are anti-globalization, especially the so-called friendshoring. You know, it's not only against the economic rules, but also, you know, very ideological against the fundamental economic interest. So there are, of course, institutional factors, such as the deadlock in multi-trading system and the increased tariff. Now, let me go quickly through my slides on the US-China trade war to show you how high and how fast the tariffs has been increased. The China-US trade war is an unprecedented trade conflict in the world history. You know, if we look at the trade conflicts between the US and Japan in the 1980s and the 90s, it's not comparable to the current US-China trade war. It's not comparable. At that time, it's only billions of dollars involved. Now it's hundreds of billions of dollars goods involved. At that time, tariff surge was avoided because of the wise choice of the Japanese. You know, they use various, negotiation techniques and institutional arrangements to avoid major trade confrontation with the US. But this time, it happened. And it didn't stop in the trade area. It has become a full-fledged economic confrontation between the two major economies. And what's worse now is these are two major, not only two largest economies, but also two major powers in the world with significant culture and ideological differences between them. So there's a danger of new Cold War, which has been, the danger has been strengthened by the Ukraine war. So I'm sorry to say there are so many, wars ongoing. Some of them are economic, some of them are real wars, unfortunately. So the trade war has been categorized by surging tariffs. The trade weighted average of Chinese tariffs on US imports has increased beyond the pre-WTO level, while the US equivalent has risen threefold than that time. And the level is as high as the level of the early 1930s. So but I believe more significant influence is in the technological area, which has largely influenced the growth and especially international expansion of Chinese tech giants like Huawei. Secondly, it has the danger to create two systems, technological, innovative, and standard systems in the world economy, which may hamper innovation. And also, it happened not only in the area of stiff competition between the two major economic powers, but also spill over to the scientific, to the academic areas. Normal scientific and academic exchanges has been affected by this, which is a pity. The pandemic, then let's look at one of the major disturbance, which is the pandemic. This graph shows that the influence of the pandemic on the growth of the global economy was much more serious than the financial crisis. Looking from the long-term perspective, you know, as I predicted in the early years, indeed, there's a shift of global economy from high-speed growth to low-speed growth. There's a more than 1 percentage point decrease due to the global financial crisis. And it seems something similar may happen. In the coming decade, the global economic growth may further decrease. This is not only due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also because of the long-term implication of the ongoing war, the high inflation, and the shift of economic policy, the risk of high inflation, and so on. Due to the pandemic, the global economy shrank by more than 3% in 2020. And last year, there has been a very strong recovery of about 6%. Why there has been such a strong recovery, I think the monetary policy in the US and other major developed economies played a key role. This figure shows the interest rate in the US since 2003, early 2003. It also shows the size and the composition of the Fed assets. From this figure, global financial crisis and the outbreak of the pandemic, the US monetary authority adopted the same policy approach. Reduce the interest rate to zero, immediately to zero, and then start QE, purchasing directly federal bonds. You see, these are the similar patterns. And if we adopt a longer historical perspective, we can compare what happened during the global financial crisis and the outbreak of the pandemic with what happened in 1929. At that time, economy suffered from the same shock, but the monetary policy remained the same. Thanks to Keynes, there's a significant fiscal intervention at that time, which dragged the Western economy from the disaster. But the productive losses and the skyrocketing in unemployment was really disastrous. During the global financial crisis, what happened, is the very bravery and innovative policy approach of QE, which saved the US and the global economy. A lesson has been learned, and the success has been replicated during the pandemic. Because of the shock was even more serious than the global financial crisis, and mandated QE was implemented. During and after the financial crisis, it's 3 rounds of QE with a limited amount of injecting cash liquidity into the economy. But in March 2020, the Fed announced unlimited QE. The other difference is during the first round of QE, the Fed was purchasing government bonds. And this time, the Fed has even started to buy corporate bonds. And the other 2 differences are more interesting. One is the timing of exit. After the global financial crisis, from this figure, we can see that the Fed started the exit 5 or 6 years later. But this time, the Fed couldn't wait because of the high inflation. In the US, it's above 8%. In Europe, it's similar. During the global financial crisis, the Eurozone has adopted a cautious approach. But this time they did similar things in introducing QE. Then inflation came in both the US and Europe. And both economies has to retreat from this approach because of the high inflation. This is a fundamental difference because the QE has become so effective and so successful that, we can say that in any kind of external shocks, the monetary authority can use QE to save the economy. But this time, the high inflation highlighted the limitation of this policy approach. And it also leads to a rather quick exit of this policy approach, which will bring a lot of risk to the world economy, especially for emerging economies. Okay, now let's turn to the second part of my presentation, which is about China. Professor Ji mentioned Professor Xiang, the dean of the CKGSB, our common friends. I remember Professor Xiang, obviously, to know the Earth better, we have to look at from the moon. Similarly, to know the Chinese economy better, we have to look from outside with a global perspective. So from the global perspective, to understand the Chinese economy, I think there are three issues. First, the comparative angle. If we compare the growth performance of China and all other developing countries and regions after the Second World War, we can see that China is among the rare number of successful players, many of which are in East Asia. And most of them leverage the force of globalization in their development. This is the comparative angle. Also, there's the experience angle, because people can learn from their peer, a country can learn from their neighbors, their peers, the successful countries in the race of development. Yeah, China learned a lot in the early years from the Asian tigers. The so-called Chinese miracle is a continuation of so-called East Asian miracle. Similar approach, openness, export promotion instead of import substitution, which was dominant in the early decades of after-war development practice. But the Chinese miracle is also beyond the East Asian miracle in many sense, in terms of the size, the global significance, and especially the technological and innovative progress of the country. So this is a second angle, the experience. And I think the third angle is the contextual analysis. In a globalized, interconnected world, any country has to grow in an international context. And for China, the wave of hyper-globalization after the end of the Cold War provided a golden opportunity. China has grasped this opportunity and achieved a growth miracle. But the problem is this context has been changing. If the beneficial context was categorized by globalization, now is a new context of deglobalization, which has been happening as early as in the global financial crisis, and then, as I mentioned, a series of major events which shaken the foundation of globalization. Therefore, the global context of China's economic development has changed. A new turbulent time has come. Of course, the positive factors are still there, such as technological progress, regional cooperation, highlighted by regional grouping like RCEP and so on. But there are a lot of negative factors, like the geopolitical turmoil, the protectionist policies, a new strengthened anti-globalization sentiment, and so on. The continued deadlock in multilateral trading system, and the difficulties in international policy coordination. This is a major difference between now and the global financial crisis. After the crisis, through mechanism like G20, global economic powers coordinated very well. This coordination includes both major developed economies, all G7 members, and major emerging economies, BRICS, and all these 20 largest economies coordinated very well. This is different from now. Now this kind of coordination is almost impossible. So facing a fundamentally changed context of external context of development, how can China do? The Chinese government has adopted some new strategy, such as emphasize on the so-called internal circling, which seems to be quite defensive. If our economy cannot be further internationalized, if there's a limitation in trade and investment, let's rely more on our domestic economy. And there's another major area of adjustments in the Chinese development model is more emphasis on so-called common prosperity. So the Chinese government has been revising the country's development strategy and model. Here, I want to add some of personal perspective, personal advice, which I have been expressed through various interviews and articles in official media. I hope which can play a constructive role in the revising the China's development model. First, I think the model needs to have more flexibility, because China has changed, the size of the economy has changed, the competitiveness of the economy has changed, and the global context has changed fundamentally. So there needs to be more flexibility in macroeconomic policies, in regional economic development, in policies at the firm level, real estate market, the digital economy, and so on. In the early years of China's reform and opening up, the major regional differences are between the East and the West, between the coast regions and the inland. Now, this differences has been much changed, and a new line of difference has emerged, which is between the North and the South. The Northeast provinces of China has lost more than 10 million population during the past decade. This shows the growth rate of northern provinces has been much slower than the growth of southern provinces. So things has changed. But the major regional economic development strategy is still the so-called Go West. There's not yet northern revival strategy, formal one appeared. So there's need of adjustment in many areas. And in terms of the relationship between China and the external world, I think we should consider more compatibility. As we see from the early figure, 2001 is a turning point in the global economic history when China joined the WTO. In fact, if you look at the tariff reduction, it's very minor. The tariff reduction cost by China's WTO accession was quite minor. A major change is in terms of reduced uncertainty. because at that time, China revised more than 1,000 domestic laws and regulations. This linked up the Chinese system to the global system, which much reduced the uncertainty for foreign investors. If we look at the data of foreign investment in China, before 2001, a dominant part of that investment was from Hong Kong and Asian regions, especially Hong Kong. It's after 2001 that foreign investment from Japan, Korea, especially Western countries, has flooded in. So that's because of the reduced uncertainty. Why uncertainty is reduced is because the two systems, the Chinese system and the Western system, the rule-based system has converged. The compatibility has been enhanced. But now, 20 years afterwards, China's system is still based on, the system of the WTO entry is similar. There are some changes, but basically the overall architecture remains the same. But the global context has changed so much. The Chinese economy has changed so much. Now China's market share in global exports is 15%. At that time, maybe only 2 or 3%. It's very, very different. So how to further enhance the compatibility of the Chinese system with the external world has become very, very important. At that time, at the time of the WTO entry, it's simply a matter of copying. We introduce the Western system, we adopt the Western rules. But now it's more, not only this linking up, but also the adjustment of the rules because of of course, there are many difficult areas like industrial subsidy, SOE, IPR, technology transfer, and so on. But at the strategic level, compatibility is crucial. A newly enhanced compatibility between China and the external world is crucial. So in terms of the further growth, in my book, I introduced a model showing that the Chinese growth will slow down, ideally in a controlled manner, through 3 platforms. During 2010 to 2020, growth rate would reduce to a range between 6% and 8%. This has come true. And for this decade, the growth rate should be between 4% and 6%. I'm sure this will also come true. And except for the disturbance of the pandemic, which dragged down the Chinese growth to 2%. Even the 2% growth was the highest among major economies in 2020. But it's inevitable to grow slower when you grow bigger. Yeah, so that's natural. I don't go to the economic theories, but it's a common sense. So finally, let's look at the most interesting part of my presentation, the multi-dimensional economic transformation. It may also be the most boring part because there are a lot of figures and numbers, which I draw specifically for you. So this is a very important framework which show the multi-dimensional economic transformation for an emerging economy in general, and China in particular. The first transformation is marketization, or we say transition, economic transition from a closed to an open economy. The second transformation is internationalization, growing openness of the economy from a closed to an open economy. The third line is industrialization, from a rural economy to an industrialized economy, further to service-based economy. And the fourth transformation is urbanization. You know, these four transitions, I came up of the idea when I was doing my PhD. So later, this was published in my thesis in 2004. So this is my old understanding of the multi-dimensional transformation of the Chinese economy. Why a miracle has happened? I was thinking why China could, at that time, 2003, 2002, I was thinking why China could grow more than 10% for more than 2 decades. Then I came up with the idea that this 4-dimensional transformation can help me explain the Chinese miracle. So this is the first part of the analytical framework. And then 10 years later, I was thinking, what would be the next for the Chinese economy? While I was giving a speech at Taipei Summit in 2014, I came up with the idea of the new transformations, which include the shift to consumption first, the shift to services second, digitalization the third, and the greening of the Chinese economy the fourth. I think these 4 new transformations will shape the future of the Chinese economy. So, of course, we can integrate these 2 approaches, 2 analytical frameworks into the same approach and link them. So, in my later slides, following this logic, I show you very quickly how these transformations happen in China. These are very important because I remember last time when I was giving a speech at a CKGSP event, someone asked a question, how to find the best investment target in China. At that time, I mentioned, look at the trend, look at the major transformations that I brought to your attention. The shift to consumption, the shift to services, the digitalization, the growing role of AI in the economy, and the greening of the economy. Yeah? This is very important, not only for investors, but also for entrepreneurs. They need to foresee the trends. And they need to find small opportunities within these mega trends and to establish themselves quickly. So how these mega trends are happening, let me show you. For the first 4, I show you the trend between, in fact, I will show you the 3, internationalization, industrialization, urbanization, because I haven't think about how to measure the degree of marketization. Yeah, but I have draw these figures for you in terms of the other transformation. For the later four new transformations, I show the period between 2000 and 2020. You can compare the first half of this period and the second half of this period to see, okay, all my prediction of the four new transformations has come true. So this is internationalization. We use the indicator of foreign trade dependency, which is the share, the ratio of total export and import to GDP. The high peak of that ratio is 2006, 64%. It has been gradually reduced to a level now at 30, around 30. So this shows for the economy of China's size, you cannot grow, you cannot internationalize, enhance the degree of internationalization in an unlimited way. For country like Vietnam is okay, because the country's foreign trade dependency now is above 200%. It can do so, but for the size of the Chinese economy is impossible. The global market cannot afford, such reliance. In the reform and opening process of China, we see crossing the river by dropping the stone. We don't know where to go, and we don't know how to go to the other side of the river. So we grab the stone. That's the philosophy of Deng in the reform. We don't know yet, but let's learn by doing. Let's know how to improve our system by learning from our neighbors, from Western powers, and from our own reform process. And in Vietnam, they say crossing the river by grabbing China. So they have a neighbor which, shows them an ideal model of development, simply copying and following. And then Vietnam now is a star performer in the region. Now let's look at industrialization. I always use this column to show the absolute amount. This column is, in this case, this column is the total industrial output. And the line is the share of secondary and tertiary sectors. Manufacturing services is the share in total GDP. And over the past 40 decades, the share has been risen from 70 to about 90%. Why 70 before the reform? It's because in the early 50s, China has already a first round of industrialization, which is copying the USSR model, the Soviet model, the planned economy model. During that time, China has, to some extent, industrialized based on the closed economy and the planned economy, centrally planned economy model, which is less efficient. And the industrialization process is also very costly for the rural area, for the farmers. And it is during the reform period, a new wave of industrialization based on globalization and a market system, which led to a new unprecedented wave of globalization, not only in China's history, but also in the history of the global economy. It's unprecedented, massive process of industrialization. And then urbanization. It is measured by the share of urban population. China is not yet an industrialized country, because if you look at the share of urban population, it's only 64. This shows, the degree of China's development. China is not yet a developed country. Yeah, there's still more than 2/3 of population live in rural area. And this also highlights the potential of China's growth. There's still a long way to go for China's development. So these are the 3 dimensions of so-called conventional transformation. Yeah. I think I have to skip some of the slides. The first one is the shift towards services, meaning the enhancing role of consumption in GDP growth. Before it's investment, the Chinese model is based on heavy investment in real estate, in industrial productive capacity, in infrastructure. And more China will shift to a consumption-driven economic growth. This is a message. Message is very simple. And in the strong wave of globalization, China took the opportunity of, growing global market and shifting productive capacities. And China's manufacturing service was particularly strong, and the share was very, very high. Regarding China's economic development level, the share of manufacturing is very high. It's somehow abnormally high because of what I mentioned, the characteristics of the Chinese model and the global imbalance. Production was too much concentrated into China. And in the future, I mean, starting from 2010, yeah, when the idea was there, China will be shifting to services. That's a natural process of development. And then greening, when I prepare this slide for you, even myself was surprised by how fast China has been greening its economy. I look at some pollution figures, it's reducing drastically. And now I use this figure to show you the power generation. The columns shows the size of renewable energy. In the history, there's a high amount of hydropower, But what's astonishing is the rapid increase of wind and solar power. It rose so quickly if you look at the columns. And now, sorry, I cannot see this. The share of wind and solar power in total capacity is almost 30%. It's unbelievable. So when I prepared these slides, I myself was astonished by the rapid pace of China in greening the power sector and the economy as a whole. I remember recently Elon Musk had a post in Twitter delivering a similar message. I think it must be, the similar experience when he saw a figure like this, that renewable energy sector has been growing so quickly, and the capacity is so big now. So the last part, maybe I skip, is about digitalization and sustainable development. Maybe I go through quickly because it's for you. It's prepared for you. So in terms of the new transformations, I have shown you 3 dimensions. Now it's the 4th dimension with some expanded message. First, I was thinking, what's the concept of informatization and digitalization? What are I think the first refers more to the equipment, the production and the installation. And the second, the digitalization, refers more to the application involving firms, users, and the data. That's why when I try to measure digitalization, I use the equipment, user, and the amount of data flow. In terms of equipment, it's mobile phone and broadband access per 100%. And in terms of users, I use internet user and mobile internet user. And then the data amount in terms of the mobile internet data flow. You can see a continued digitalization of the Chinese economy, and especially the surging mobile data flow starting from 2015. This is the new phenomenon of digitalization of the Chinese economy. Every aspect of the digital economy become mobile, and the normal Chinese people's life has been changed by this wave of mobile internet. And as I show you here, a wave of innovation driven by innovation not only in technological area, but also business model innovation, innovation in introducing application scenarios. And these are the fundamental forces. Innovation and entrepreneurship are the fundamental driver of China's accelerated digitalization. And in the process, PE and VC investment played a key role. And what's a new feature in China is the importance of CVC, corporate VC. The digital giants like Alibaba and Tencent, their investment business has generated more than half of profits for these companies and reshaped China's digital ecosystem and the innovative system. Hopefully in a way, because both pros and cons. They may support the rapid growth of new startups, but also they may destroy potential competitors in certain areas. But overall, I find the hotspots in terms of entrepreneurial activity and VC investment in China over the past decade. You can see a very rapid pace of growth, emergence of new models, replacing the old one, keep moving up. And during this process, I think government policy played a rather positive role, but the recent change of regulatory environment has also some impact. With this rapid pace of digitalization, energy consumption has become a problem because now data centers has become so-called electricity tiger in China. They use up too much energy. They use up too much electricity. To 2025, the share could reach 4%. I think the global average would be less than 2%. So I think for starting in China and for being successful in any new areas, a startup needs to have three characteristics. The first, born global. You know, a successful startup need to be a global firm. Maybe it's from an early stage, at least to have a global view. The entrepreneurs need to have a global view in the early stage. Born global, which is, you know, has already been covered by the international business theory. And the second, I think they need to be born digital. In such a highly digitalized world economy, a successful business, either in the digital sector or in traditional sector, must to be leveraging digital technologies, artificial intelligence, and to leverage these new technologies for their businesses. And the third, I think they need to be born sustainable. As I put here, they need to create harmony. Their business model needs to create harmony between economy, environment, and society. And they need to put people in the center of their model, their hardware and software. Thank you. I hope there are still time left for discussions, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Liang, for a very in-depth analysis and also overview of the global system and globalization and deglobalization, as well as the China's development model, which had been changing, as well as talking about the future digitalization and etc. So thank you for your valuable advice to the entrepreneurs here. So we will open up for questions. So anyone who would have a question, please just open your mic and you can ask the questions as you wish.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Just kind of question on, you said that in the future, consumption and services will be a bigger share of the Chinese economy. Wouldn't that fundamentally mean that, basically that, the Chinese population consumers will have more wealth to spend on that, right? Because the source of those will come from consumers. So what is changing, or what will change more for that to happen? And what is the driver behind that change?
Sorry, there's a little bit problem of the sound. Could you repeat and summarize, because I couldn't hear clearly, because maybe it's because of my speaker.
Or it could be my mic. My mic has had problems. Can you hear me now better? Or can you hear me as well? Is it my mic, or is it?
I put my speaker here so that I can hear you.
No, I think the Sheila, it's your mic.
You still have background noise, from our side. We can hear you very clearly.
Well, Shirley, just repeat your question.
Okay.
I can understand, and then I will explain to Dr. Liang.
Okay. So Dr. Liang, when you said that in the future, one big change is that the share of consumption and services will be a bigger share in the Chinese economy.
Mm-hmm.
So what that fundamentally means is that wouldn't mean that the Chinese consumers' purchasing power will be bigger, because they're the ones doing the consumption and doing the purchase of services. So what is changing, and what will change further to drive this, that their share of wealth is actually increasing as part of the overall economy?
Yeah, so I think the increasing share. Now I put the speaker here. Now the increasing share of consumption and services is one of the main transformations that I highlighted in my framework. And this has been happening starting from 2012. the share has been increasing very quickly. I think there are several, let's look at first why this is happening. I think first is because of the rising income of the population and the rising middle income class. You know, the purchasing power of the population is growing very quickly. This is first, and secondly, it's because of the restructuring of the Chinese economy. Before, it's a production and export-based economy, and now more and more shifting to consumption and service-based economy. This transition has been very, very clear over the past decade. And the implication is huge. For example, for Chinese companies, the private sector and the entrepreneurs, those who are doing traditional activities, by traditional, I mean manufacturing, exporting, you know, the conventional strengths of the Chinese economy, has to deal with difficulties, slower growth, less market opportunities, harsher competition from neighboring countries, and so on. But in the new emerging economic areas, which are related to the four transformations, you see more and more business opportunities and successful entrepreneurs. I mean, Bo is an expert of entrepreneurial activity and unicorns. If we count the number of emerging unicorns over the past decade, you know, very few are from manufacturing traditional economic activities. Most of them are newly emerging sectors, which are often linking the transformations, like, you know, let me use the, okay, which are often, you know, in the cross-cutting area of these transformations, you know, linking consumption and digitalization, e-commerce, you know, and linking services, for example, the digital driven new business models. Yeah, so this framework of transformation can help us understand the mega trends in the Chinese economy. Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? And macro level data over the past decade shows indeed this transformation have been happening in a big way. And firm level data shows that indeed successful startups, companies are emerging from these new transformations, especially the cross-cutting part of it. And if we look at the look into the future of the Chinese economy, the carbon neutrality transformation will bring more and more opportunities. And the digital, I was speaking at a seminar organized by CCICED, the Chinese environmental body, highest level environmental policy making body, together with the World Economic Forum and other organizations. I was speaking at a seminar. And this seminar is about the twin transformation of digitalization and greening, how these two processes are evolution, you know, how co-evolve, how these two processes co-evolve and mutually supportive. Now, let me give you one example, the electric cars. In fact, these cars are not only innovative in terms of energy, but also innovative in terms of digital. Yeah, they are electric and smart cars. And in this area, US is clearly the global leader, and China is closely following. And in this booming sector, as I mentioned, the cross-cutting area of greening, digitalization, great opportunity emerged. Several unicorns, Chinese unicorns emerged. Many of them become listed, and they are in the group of second-tier companies in competition with Tesla, and gaining a very high market share now in China, and exporting also a lot. So this example shows that, you know, as I mentioned, looking at the mega trend, find the small opportunities and take these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one. Do you hear me?
And in fact,
Yes, Conrad.
at the beginning of the lecture, I'd like to have a to the table so that I can know every one of you. So I hope you can, you know, we can discuss and you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, Conrad, if you may turn on your camera and introduce yourself first.
Okay, let me try that. Do you see me? I'm in
Yes.
a park, so okay. First of all, I'm Conrad. I come from Poland. I'm a founder and a CEO of a tech-driven replacement of booking at this commercial real estate sector, offices, warehouses, and retail spaces. We're in this, well, we've got a worldwide view. First of all, we've got technology to disrupt this market, and we believe we are in the center of a human being, of an employee, that we can adjust the location of office due to the commute time, due to the preferences of surrounding locations, and etc., etc. So basically, that's long story short. And well, I'm not sure if it's time for questions more, but you mentioned Alibaba and you mentioned VCs, and I'm sure where I understood it correctly, but you mentioned that half of the income of Alibaba is coming from those VCs. Did I get that correct, or did I make some mistakes?
Half of the profits. If you know, first PE and VC investment, private equity and venture capital investment in China played a key role in supporting innovative activities in the digital and broader sectors, and in supporting entrepreneurial activities in China. They played a key role.
Okay, do you have some?
Yeah, within this investment landscape, what's interesting is the growing role of CVC, corporate venture capital investment. And they are dominated by major Chinese digital giants like Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, the parent of TikTok, yeah, and Xiaomi,
Yep.
and so on. So all these major digital players, they are also major VC investors. And if you look at the breakdown of their profits, not income, if you look at the breakdown of their profits, investment profits from investment has accounted for, in many cases, 1/3 or more than half. So
That's outstanding. That's outstanding.
Interesting phenomenon, yeah.
Yep.
And also, you know, from the policy perspective, the competition policymakers need to think about the implications for innovation. You know, the vertical relationship, and for the startups and the entrepreneurs, they also need to think about, you know, the pros and cons of joining the ecosystem of one of the digital giants. How to grow in a better way with or without the support, financial support of these companies. All these digital giants has their own ecosystem. Yeah, in some sense, they are dominating the Chinese digital landscape, not only in terms of market operation, but also in terms of emergence of new players.
Okay, do you have any connections to those Alibaba platforms, accelerators, stuff like this? So I could send a pitch deck, something like this, or what's the way to connect with them?
My closest connection to Alibaba is to the CEO, because we are from the same university, same year. So, but I don't think he's dealing with this directly. And recently, because of my work in the area of assessing sustainable performance of digital sector, there's an interaction, in this area. I think in terms of investment and how to grow in China, Professor Ji is the best source of information, and you are in the right place to start.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I hope we can connect after, so we stay in touch. Thank you very much.
So Zan, introduce yourself and ask the question.
Hi there, Guoyong. I'm the founder of Meek, which is a one-stop shop for startups and entrepreneurs to create, build, and scale their startup. It was so really interesting listening to everything you've had to say, and I've spent a bit of time in China and got quite a few friends who are based out in China and working out there, some with quite successful businesses. And one part that I'm sort of would be super interested to hear your viewpoint is around the sort of educational sort of element for the Chinese, because in the past, obviously, a lot of them have been coming over to the UK and the USA to be educated, remaining there for some years and then returning. Some of them have returned back, some of them have been based out here and sort of made the UK or USA or Australia their sort of homeland. And do you see that trend very much still continuing, that the US and the UK is very much sort of regarded, and Australia is the places to go to educate your children and for the youth to be educated? Or do you think it's changing slightly more now that the young are becoming slightly more Chinese sort of orientated and they're best sort of educated and remaining in China, and the sort of Western education isn't what it used to be? So
yeah, thank you for your question. In fact, this is a another very important trend in China, which I believe will shape the future of China. Because now, if you look at the generations of Chinese leaders, they came from different backgrounds. Some of them were educated in the Republic period. Some of them were educated in the early decades of People's Republic. Some of them were educated during the Cultural Revolution. And of course, the next generation will come from the next era. And I think at the end of the day, someone educated in the West will come to the center stage. So in this sense, this is a very, very important issue for China. And they bring back knowledge, linkages, and new ways of seeing things and doing business to China. Very, very important. In terms of your question, I think this will continue. Why? First is the cultural reason, because the Chinese emphasize very much education. They even want to spend a very high share of their fortunes for the education of their kids. So this is this will not change, and of course they will spend that for the best education, which is in the US, in the UK, Canada, Australia, and many other parts of the world. And I think the English-speaking universities are still dominating the list of top universities, and they will continue to be targeted by Chinese students and their parents. But there will be a diverging trend between the US and other countries, especially the UK. I think the UK will benefit. And the US, because of what I mentioned, the current issues, may be in a weaker position in terms of, the choice of talented Chinese students in picking up the top universities, because of both sides. There's a reluctance, for example, of top American technology universities in, admitting Chinese students.
Yeah, I think there's still, I hear from people in the US, there's sort of a bit of sort of racism at the moment, almost towards the sort of Chinese students within the universities to a certain degree.
There are issues here. I think it is to a much less degree in the UK.
Yeah.
And the UK is very competitive in this sense and will benefit from the worsening relationship between China and the US and its spillover effects to education.
Yeah. No, brilliant. Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because that's what a sort of core part of the MEET proposition is obviously the young entrepreneurs. So education is so important for them.
Yeah, for me, I'm thinking about the education of my elder son. I hope he can go to the UK.
Well, if he needs any help, I'm sure he can message me all day.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure your help is appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? So Dr. Liang, the one who asked the first question, Shilei, his company was doing something very breakthrough. They're trying to create proteins from the plants, and then those proteins will be sold to the food companies to make the final product. So they're trying to solve the world food problem issues. Instead of conventional crops, they're using the plants that are usually not being used for food production. And those plants are cheap and relatively available, easy to grow. So that they're very big, very big, substantial in what they do.
Mr. Zhang, Zhang Shilei.
Yeah.
He's based, where is he based?
It's in Finland.
He's Chinese, yeah?
Yes, I think he might be the second generation. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Liang, and for sharing your insights. Though we had a small crowd, but regardless, you have put all your effort into that. I really appreciate that. And I'm sure it will leave a very important lesson to them. And we have more people who will be watching your lecture and in the next few days.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that one.
Thank you. 梁博士，我待会儿给你打一个微信，你方便吗？
好呀，好，没问题。
好，那我们先挂了哈，我给你打微信。OK， 拜拜。
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
拜拜呀。
Thank you，丽萍。
谢谢你，梁博士。拜拜。